On first arriving in Cambridge, Washington had been offered the home of the president of Harvard, Samuel Langdon, for his residence. But finding it too cramped for his needs and those of his staff, his military family, the general moved a few days later to one of the largest, most elegant houses in town, a gray clapboard Georgian mansion half a mile from the college on the King's Highway. 3 stories tall, with an unobstructed view of the Charles River, it belonged to a wealthy Loyalist, John Vassall, who, fearing for his life and the lives of his family, had abandoned the place, fine furnishings and all, to take refuge in Boston. For Washington, who had a fondness for handsome architecture and river views, the house suited perfectly and would serve as his command headquarters through the siege, with his office established in a drawing room off the front hall. The house became a hive of activity, with people coming and going at all hours. It was there that Washington conferred with his highest-ranking officers, convened his councils of war, and with staff help coped with numberless problems of organization, issued orders, and labored over correspondence paperwork without end, letters to Congress, appeals to the governors of the New England states and the legislature of Massachusetts. There, too, he received or entertained local dignitaries and politicians and their wives, always in elegant fashion, as was both his pleasure and part of the role he felt he must play. And as with everything connected with that role, his uniform, the house, his horses and equipage, the military dress and bearing of his staff, appearances were of great importance. A leader must look and act the part. To judge by surviving household accounts, Virginia hospitality more than lived up to its reputation at Cambridge. Purchases included quantities of beef, lamb, roasting pig, wild ducks, geese, turtle, and a variety of fresh fish, of which Washington was especially fond. Plums, peaches, barrels of cider, brandy, and rum by the gallon, and limes by the hundreds, these to fend off scurvy. One entry accounts for payment to a man named Simon Lovett for carting a load of liquor from Beverly. The domestic staff included a steward, 2 cooks, one of whom was French, a kitchen maid, a washerwoman, 8 others whose duties were not specified, and included several slaves, plus a personal tailor for the commander, one Giles Alexander. Washington's body servant, a black slave named William, or Billy Lee, was his steady companion. Riding with Washington on his rounds of the defenses, Billy Lee became a familiar figure, a large spyglass in a leather case slung over one shoulder. As apparent to all, His Excellency was in the prime of life. A strapping man of commanding presence, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed perhaps 190 pounds. His hair was reddish-brown, his eyes gray-blue, and the bridge of his prominent nose unusually wide. The face was largely unlined, but freckled and sun-beaten, and slightly scarred by smallpox. A few defective teeth were apparent when he smiled. He carried himself like a soldier and sat a horse like the perfect Virginia gentleman. It was the look and bearing of a man accustomed to respect and to being obeyed. He was not austere. There was no hint of arrogance. Amiable and modest were words frequently used to describe him, and there was a softness in his eyes that people remembered. Yet he had a certain distance in manner that set him off from or above others. Be easy, but not too familiar, he advised his officers, lest you subject yourself to a want of that respect which is necessary to support a proper command. It was a philosophy unfamiliar to most Yankees, who saw nothing inappropriate about a captain shaving one of his soldiers, or rough-hewn General Putnam standing in line for his rations along with everyone else. Nor was it easy for Putnam and others of the older officers to change their ways. On one occasion, surveying the work on defenses by horseback, Putnam paused to ask a soldier to throw a large rock in the path up onto the parapet. "I am a corporal," the soldier protested. "Oh, I ask your pardon, sir," said the general, who dismounted and threw the rock himself, to the delight of all present. The Philadelphia physician and patriot Benjamin Rush, a staunch admirer, observed that Washington has so much martial dignity in his deportment that you would distinguish him to be a general and a soldier from among 10,000 people. There is not a king in Europe that would look like a valet de chambre by his side. A Connecticut delegate to the Continental Congress, Eliphalet Dyer, who had heartily joined in the unanimous decision to make Washington the commander-in-chief, judged him to be no harum-scarum fellow. John Adams, who had put Washington's name in nomination for the command, described him in a letter to his wife Abigail as amiable and brave. "This appointment," he wrote, "will have great effect in cementing and securing the union of these colonies," and he prophesied that Washington could become one of the most important characters in the world. After meeting the general herself for the first time as a guest at one of his social occasions at Cambridge, Abigail wrote to tell her husband he had hardly said enough. Washington's effect on the troops and young officers was striking. Joy was visible on every countenance, and it seemed as if the spirit of conquest breathed through the whole army. I hope we shall be taught to copy his example and to prefer the love of liberty in this time of public danger to all the soft pleasures of domestic life, and support ourselves with manly fortitude amidst all the dangers and hardships that attend a state of war. Joseph Reed, a young man with a long jaw and a somewhat quizzical look in his eyes, was a charming, London-trained Philadelphia lawyer who had been chosen as part of an honorary escort when Washington departed Philadelphia for his new command. Reed had intended to ride only as far as New York, but found himself so in awe of the general that he continued on to Cambridge to become his secretary, despite the fact that he had made no provisions for his wife and 3 young children, or for his law practice. As Reed explained, Washington had expressed himself to me in such terms that I thought myself bound by every tie of duty and honor to comply with his request to help him through the sea of difficulties. Few would ever provide a more succinct description of Washington's particular hold on men. Born in Tidewater, Virginia, on February 11, 1732, by the old-style calendar, George Washington was the great-grandson of John Washington, who had emigrated from Northampton, England, in 1657. His father, Augustine Washington, was a tobacco planter, also known for his noble appearance and manly proportions. His mother, Mary Bell, was widowed when Washington was 11. Because of the family's reduced circumstances, he had had little education, only 7 or 8 years of schooling by private tutor, no training in Latin or Greek or law, as had so many prominent Virginia patriots, and, as those close to him knew, he was self-conscious about this. By steady application, he had learned to write in a clear, strong hand and to express himself on paper with force and clarity. He learned to dance. Virginians loved to dance, and he was no exception. And he learned to comport himself in the elaborately polite society of the day with perfect manners and polish. Of the 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation that he had laboriously copied down as a boy, rule number 1 read, "Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those who are present." He enjoyed parties, and particularly the company of attractive women. As would be said of British officers, he liked his glass, his lass, and his game of cards. though gambling never became the obsession it was for so many of his counterparts on the British side. The great teacher for Washington was experience. At age 16, he had set out to make his way in the world as a surveyor's apprentice on an expedition into the wilderness of Western Virginia, over the Blue Ridge Mountains, and as years passed, he spent more time in the backcountry beyond the Blue Ridge than all but a few from the Tidewater. In addition, surveying proved highly remunerative. In 1753, at 20, he had been sent by the governor of Virginia to the wilds of western Pennsylvania to challenge French claims to the Allegheny River Valley, and publication of his diary of the venture, the Journal of Major George Washington, made his daring and resourcefulness known throughout the colonies and in Europe. A year later, on his first command, inexperience and poor judgment led to his famous encounter with French troops and Indians at Great Meadows, in the same remote corner of western Pennsylvania, the small, bloody backwoods incident and first defeat for Washington that set in motion the conflict that ultimately involved much of the world. I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound, he had written in a letter printed later in the London Magazine, which could be taken as the bravado of a callow youth, but as he had found, he was one of those rare few who, under fire, were without fear. As a provincial officer fighting with the British Army during General Edward Braddock's defeat in western Pennsylvania, he had shown conspicuous courage under fire and a marked ability for leadership. If, as a young officer, he seemed at times flagrantly unattractively ambitious, he had long since overcome that. In 1759, spurned in his desire for a royal commission, he had retired at age 27 to the life of a Virginia planter, and that same year married Martha Dandridge Custis of Williamsburg, an attractive, extremely wealthy widow with 2 children to whom he gave full devotion. The children, John Parke Custis and Patsy, were treated quite as though they were his own. Indeed, one of the worst tragedies of Washington's life had been the death of 17-year-old Patsy of an epileptic fit in 1773. Like other planters of the Tidewater, Washington embraced a life very like that of the English gentry. English by ancestry, he was, in dress, manner, and his favorite pastimes, as close to being an English country gentleman as was possible for an American of the day, and intentionally. His handsome green coach, with its brass fittings and leather lining, had been custom built in England to his specifications. He ordered his clothes from England, and only the finest English wools and linens and latest fashions would do. He wore English boots, English shoes, and Morocco leather slippers, all made to order for him in London. The books on his shelves, including the military treatises, were published in London. The very glass in the windows through which he viewed his domain was imported English glass. Only the year before taking command at Cambridge, Washington had commenced an ambitious expansion of his Virginia home, Mount Vernon, which, when completed, would double its size. He was adding a library and building a 2-story dining room or banquet hall, suitable for entertaining on a grand scale. He was a builder by nature. He had a passion for architecture and landscape design, and Mount Vernon was his creation, everything done to his own ideas and plans. How extremely important this was to him, and the pleasure he drew from it, few people ever understood. He had an abiding dislike of disorder, and cared intensely about every detail, wallpaper, paint color, ceiling ornaments, and insisted on perfection. He hated to be away from the project.
Even at the distance of Cambridge, with all that weighed on his mind, he worried that things were not being handled as he wished at Mount Vernon, and filled pages of instruction for his manager, Lund Washington. I wish you would quicken Landfire and Sears, the carpenters, about the dining room chimney-piece, to be executed as mentioned in one of my last letters. I wish you had done the end of the new kitchen next to the garden, as also the old kitchen, with rusticated boards. However, as it is not, I would have the corners done so in the manner of our new church. What have you done with the well? Is that walled up? Have you any accounts of the painter?